For the final topic of today, of this year's seminar, we're going to discuss the effects of the Canada-EU Free Trade Agreement on the Canadian shipping industry. I'll be looking at it from a more legal perspective. I will look at the cabotage trade regime. Some of you might know that better as coasting trade. For our American friends, that's the Jones Act, basically. And then Mr. Jack Mahoney, who is the president of Maersk Line Canada, will discuss the broader implications that he sees within the industry. It's also my honor to introduce Mr. Mahoney to you. Jack joined Maersk Line from Sealand as part of the acquisition in 1999. He graduated from the College of William and Mary in Virginia in 1990. And then he worked for a number of years in sales and sales management in a variety of US markets. He spent 2 years as well in Madison, New Jersey, as at the Maersk Line North America headquarters. He was responsible there for USA trade management. And then 3 years, the 3 following years, or that was before that, okay. 3 years he spent at Maersk Line in Copenhagen at the head office, where he was responsible for Pacific eastbound trade. And then in May 13, he headed up the USA Forwarders Sales Group and became president of Maersk Line Canada as of October 2015. We're very happy to have you here.
Thank you.
And then for those of you who do not know me, I'll introduce myself briefly as well. My name is Niels Goetijn. I'm a PhD junior associate in the Montreal office. I joined BLG 2 years ago. Some of you might have met me last year, and it's an honor to present to you today. So we'll be dealing with CETA. And when I was talking to some people in the hallways, it became clear to me that I need to explain what CETA actually is. So that's what my presentation will do. I will first introduce what CETA is. I will then also introduce what cabotage trade is, what coasting trade is, because I think a lot of people might have heard of it but don't really know what it is. And then, of course, we will look finally at what CETA does to change it and what the impact might be on the Canadian industry. And then Jack will go into more detail on the larger economic impacts. So, first things first. What is CETA? CETA is the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement that was entered into by Canada and the 28 member states of the European Union. It was adopted last year after many, many years of negotiation. I thought the first draft was circulated in 2010 already, but so it took some time. And it entered into force provisionally, and I'll need to explain what that means, on September 21st this year. So as of September 21st, Canada and the EU are now in a free trade agreement as defined under the GATT, the WTO rules. Now, provisional entry into force, that's peculiar. Normally, under international law, an agreement is negotiated by governments. They sign the agreement, and then the national parliaments have to adopt it, have to bring it home into the national legislations. Here, the governments decided that they were going to add a clause to the agreement to the effect that they would let the agreement enter into force without the parliament's green light. That's peculiar in international law. It means that, and you may have heard that, I'm from Belgium, I have heard a lot about this. Wallonia was a regional parliament that held up its giving the green light to the government to actually sign this agreement because they said, well, we don't have enough guarantees for our social protection and stuff like that. So it means that in the next coming years, parliaments in Europe, the 28 national parliaments, but also the regional parliaments and the Canadian Parliament will still have to adopt this agreement into national law, okay? And that might be problematic in the EU. At the same time, it's entered into force provisionally. So countries will can begin to benefit from it as of, well, September 21st. And so it will be difficult for a regional parliament to say, well, I'm not going to adopt it. And that's still something else than saying I'm going to repeal it, okay? Not adopting simply means, well, it will just continue to be in force provisionally. And what does that then mean under international law? Big question mark. either way. Earlier this year, I was involved in a project that the European Commission engaged BLG on, where we were asked to look into how is Canada implementing this agreement. And I was heavily involved in, in reviewing the Canadian legislation and the changes that Canada was doing to the Coasting Trade Act under Chapter 14 of CETA, because that deals with marine transportation services. So I said the word a couple times, coasting trade. What does that mean? Well, under the Coasting Trade Act in Canada, coasting trade basically means the movement of persons, people, or goods from one point in Canada to another point in Canada. That's basically it, okay? So anytime you move by vessel, goods or people between two Canadian ports, you're on the hook for coasting trade. And for good measure, the last line on that slide says the engaging by ship in any other marine activity of a commercial nature in Canadian waters. You put something on a ship, you're on the hook. That's basically it. From one place in Canada to another place in Canada, directly or by way of a place outside Canada. That's strange, okay? Why is that in there? Well, if you just look at the map, you say, well, I'm going from Thunder Bay to Toronto. That is coasting trade, right? 2 points in Canada. But you could say, and smart ship owners would say, well, I just dock for a few hours in Detroit. That's the US, so it's no longer coasting trade. No? Well, yes, it would still be coasting trade. That's why they added that little hook in the definition. So you move goods or people from between 2 ports in Canada, you're on the hook for coasting trade. Now, the Coasting Trade Act says that no foreign vessel or non-duty paid ship can engage in coasting trade. That is the law in Canada. It's a protectionist measure that is, again, very similar to the Jones Act, that is installed to protect Canadian ship owners from open competition. Now, the result is that only Canadian flagged vessels can do coasting trade. The exception is a coasting trade regime, is a coasting trade license or flag waiver. You may have heard of that. Which means that a foreign ship or foreign ship owner can apply to the government of Canada to have that ship brought into the coasting trade and do a specific job, can help out with constructing a bridge, for instance, can help out with fueling services in the Arctic, but you need to apply for a license. And a license is only granted after the government has made sure that there is no Canadian vessel that is available and technically capable of doing the job that you want that foreign vessel to do. So again, this is a measure to protect Canadian ship owners, to give them a chance to do the job that you want the foreign vessel to do. Now, as I said before, this is a protectionist regime. Protectionism usually doesn't jive well with the free trade agreement. Okay, so the CETA agreement is making huge changes to this. It gives preferential market access to EU entities. It allows more ships into the Canadian coasting trade for a number of specific activities, and we'll talk about those. And it reduces the duties that need to be paid for a vessel to be imported into Canada. So, in large terms, it becomes easier for a number of people to come to Canada, and it becomes easier for foreign vessels to come to Canada. And they can do certain things. I will speak about the who gets more access, and I'll talk about what they can do. Who gets more access? 2 categories of EU entities. It becomes a bit technical, but bear with me. Oh, and by the way, you're getting tested after this, so pay attention. First of all, entities incorporated in an EU member state. That's very simple. A Belgian company, a Croatian company. I'm not talking about St. Helens company. It is the Canadian regulations have defined what it means to be an EU member state. They have defined what it means to be an EU register. They have defined what it means to be an international register for the EU. I have the regulation here with me. It's actually been updated just a couple weeks ago. And so the EU excludes all of those territories that the EU countries have overseas. It is only the 28 member states, a French company, a Dutch company, a German company. But there's also a second category of companies that get access to Canadian coasting trade regime. EU entities could mean an entity located outside of the EU, so Morocco, if they are controlled or owned by EU citizens or Canadian citizens, and if they use an EU-registered ship, okay? The ship has to be registered on an EU registry. For our friends in the United States, unfortunately, a non-EU company cannot mean the US. A company registered in the US does not get access to the coasting trade in Canada. Anyway, so that is the who. What can they do when they get access to the coasting trade? There's 3 activities that are being exempt from coasting trade licenses. So everybody who falls within the who gets access can do these 3 activities. Feeder services between the ports of Halifax and Montreal, and I will explain what that is. The repositioning of empty containers and dredging services. First of all, feeder services. What does that mean? Well, a Hapag-Lloyd ship comes from Hamburg, goes to Halifax, Montreal, goes back out the seaway, goes to New York, and then goes back to Hamburg. And it does that in a continuous route, okay? So every month, every other month, the ship comes to Montreal, the ship comes to Halifax. Normally under the coasting trade regime, a ship cannot pick up a container in Halifax and drop that same container in Montreal. That would be coasting trade, and they would need a license for that. So under the new rules, there is an exemption for this. So a ship that comes in, that brings goods into Canada, is exempt from obtaining a coasting trade license when they pick up containers in Halifax and drop them in Montreal, or vice versa, obviously. When they go in their outbound voyage, they can pick up containers in Montreal and drop them off in Halifax. Only those 2 ports, okay? So for instance, that means that under the new rules, a Swedish vessel can come up, can do its route, can pick up containers in Montreal, drop those same containers off in Halifax, and then move on to wherever else it is going. All of these ships have their own route, obviously. Important as well that you might offer a continuous service. That means that a European entity can simply say, I'm going to leave a vessel stationed between Halifax and Montreal. And all it does is move between Halifax and Montreal, picking up containers, dropping them off, picking up and dropping off. That's perfectly fine under the CETA agreement. That is feeder services. The second part is the repositioning of empty containers. The thing to know here is that that this is a measure simply to make life more easy for everybody. The reason that I say that is because you cannot have any financial gain from repositioning empty containers. So it has to be a gratis service. So basically it is simply for convenience sake that companies are allowed to reposition empty containers. The last part is dredging services. Foreign dredgers or EU dredgers may now be used anywhere within the Canadian national waters, okay? So Canadian companies have the ability now to hire European ships for dredging services. And I say Canadian companies because there is an explicit exclusion for the government. So government procurement is a specific chapter in CETA that has its own rules, and so it is excluded from this particular exemption. When the government wants to do big dredging works, they will have to pass through Canadian ships and Canadian ship owners, or they will have to work with coasting trade licenses. Now that we know what you can do, and we know who can do it, what is really new here? What is really going to change? I'm not going to go to cut the grass from Jack's feet here, but one of the points that is extremely important that hasn't been touched upon by CETA are work permits. Normally with BLG, what we do when a foreign client says, or a Canadian client says, I don't find a Canadian ship to do a specific job, Well, it's rather easy for us to file an application to make sure that the Canadian Transportation Agency who looks at these applications says, okay, we think there is no Canadian vessel available. So you can bring the vessel into Canada. That is fine. The difficult part is obtaining work permits and crewing these vessels. So normally, you cannot crew your vessel with European crew without work permits. You need to have Canadian crew those vessels. So what they have done with CETA, they have made it more easy to not have to go for the license, but that was the easy part. The hard part is getting the work permits, and that is still an open question, whether or not the Canadian government, and I know we have somebody from Transport Canada, they might comment on that. But the latest information that I have is that there are discussions between IRCC, so the Citizenship and Immigration Service, and Transport Canada to see whether or not these work permits are really required or whether they may be exempted. I understand as well that it is the government's position that they should no longer require work permits, but that is under advisement. So, time to test your knowledge. I have 2 questions for you. A Belgian vessel and crew, can it be used in a bridge construction project in Montreal? Yes, without issue, as long as you pay the taxes and you respect the regulations. Yes, but only if you have a coasting trade license and you have a work permit, or no, only Canadian vessels may be used. I see a lot of people who go no. I should have gone quiet. So yes, constructing a bridge, and it's actually a real-life example that I'm using, because you may have noted that here in Montreal we're building a huge new Champlain bridge. There are foreign vessels being used in the construction because they have to have certain technical capabilities. These vessels are sometimes purpose-built for one particular bridge project or for bridge projects in general. So it's not as if Canadian ship owners have these ships just lying around. So in that case, you can bring a vessel into Canada under the coasting trade regime as long as you obtain a license. So the right answer would be B. Second question is a bit more difficult. Now that CETA is into force, can a vessel that is registered in St. Martin offer fueling services in the Canadian Arctic? And every element of that question is important. So yes, without issue, yes, but if it is owned by an EU entity, yes, but only after it obtains a coasting trade license, and no, only Canadian vessels may be used. It's a bit of a difficult one, this one. If you get it right, you may be proud of yourself. It means the hangover is completely gone and you have paid well, you have paid good attention. Okay, so first of all, now that CETA has entered into force, so we know that it's under the new regime. A vessel registered in St. Martin. St. Martin is not an EU member state. It might be a secondary registry, question mark. It isn't, I can tell you, but that is one of the questions to ask yourself. And then it can, so if it is a secondary registry, which it is not, but if it were, then you have to look at ownership of the vessel, right? Is it owned by an EU entity? But since it is not a secondary registry, this vessel does not qualify under those rules. And then the question is what as well? You're offering fueling services in the Canadian Arctic. This is an economic activity that is not exempt under the new rules under CETA. So in this case, also answer C is correct. You need to have a coasting trade license to have this vessel enter into the coasting trade of Canada. Okay, that's about it. Thank you. I will hand it over to Jack now.
Thank you very much. Seems straightforward.
Yeah, forward.
Yes. So thank you, Nils, for the kind introduction. Lots of takeaways from his very good presentation. For me personally, one was I will talk with marketing about eliminating the references to years when I graduated and how long I have done things from my bio. So just let the gray hair be the indicator. This isn't just from Maersk's perspective, but even overall, one of the things that makes Canada a very attractive market, and CETA has only helped that, and I'll get to that in a moment, is that Canada's volume growth. So we're a shipping company, we count containers. So yes, we care about dollars, but I'm not talking about cargo value. But at least from the perspective of volume, Canada is growing import and export faster than global growth, faster than that country to the south. And you can see that illustrated here. These are based on industry statistics, I think, through September. So that's something that makes Canada attractive already. And then CETA should only be favorable wind behind that. And that makes us, that same marketing person who will eliminate my year references in my bio will also know that I was coming to Montreal, and this picture is not appropriate. So I apologize. I apologize. But the shipping outlook is very favorable in Canada. Of course, the market is a different size than the United States. We're a European company, and it does take some extra effort to remind people that North America and the United States are not synonyms for each other. And then certainly it's been very helpful to have Canada's growth rates inbound and outbound, regardless of what region really in the world that is more favorable than the US. But that is helping drive our interest in the Canada market, whether that's from staffing or investment. And then not least is the very pro-trade mindset that exists here. And CETA is a great example of that. Only is an absolute word. But from our perspective, it's only a favorable. And there's two only favorable wins, really. And that comes from two aspects. We can see how much is CETA related, how much is optimism about what CETA will bring, how much of it is attributable to the health of the Canadian economy or the world's interest in what Canada will buy or produces and has available for exports. But we can see it in our own numbers. I wish I could attribute it to superior leadership, but I think we have to attribute it to more tangible and credible things. But we've seen it in our own services. Demand to and from North Europe for Canada is only higher. We're really in very early days after CETA. Nils mentioned how he has had to explain it to people in the industry. And that's a little bit of a surprise to us as well about how few people either know about it or are willing to exploit it. Because really overnight, on September 21st, 98% of goods, the tariff just went away. And that typically is only good for trade. But at least in our own performance, and maybe we can take Maersk as a proxy for the shipping industry, and I mean that humbly, we've only seen the demand for volume to and from North Europe increase. And in anticipation of CETA being these favorable wins that I talked about, we started a service a week and a half after CETA took effect between Montreal and the Mediterranean. And the uptake, the customer interest in that has been very positive. So from that perspective, CETA is favorable wins on the trades between Canada and Europe. But looking at that second bullet point, and more specifically related to what Nils was talking about, it's allowing us to provide services for Canadian exporters and importers of any size, not just large entities. And Nils had talked about the example of being able to move containers now on our own ships, not having to rely on an outside entity. And a very tangible example of that, we talked about CETA took effect September 21st. The week after that, we took equipment that was surplus in Montreal, and we moved it on our own out to Halifax to take care of perishable exporters' needs there and actually also in St. John's. So almost an immediate impact that we were glad to be a part of that made it easier for Canada's exports to reach elsewhere in the world, whether that was to Europe in this case, but also elsewhere. We are always, part of it is in Maersk's DNA, but we like digits, we like numbers, we like facts. And it is hard in Canada sometimes to get those down to the level of detail that we want. and that's fine. We'll work around it. But when people say, well, where are you seeing the potential? Well, as I mentioned before, 98% of goods that traded between Europe and Canada, the tariff went away. So the answer is everything. But some headlines or some headings on what commodity those are, they're all illustrated here. I won't go through an anecdote on each, but we have felt it, not necessarily in every segment yet, but in a lot of the segments here. And since we are, as I mentioned before, still in very early days with CETA, we're anticipating that, like a lot of trade agreements that we have seen implemented in the past, it will be slow, steady, and almost irreversible progress in the trade between Canada and North Europe. So yes, we care about the trade volumes, but we also are very pleased with the addressing of the Coasting Trade Act, so we can do things, as I was just illustrating before, moving the equipment more easily, more effectively, more efficiently between two markets under our own control. So that are my very brief comments about what we have seen from CETA, because it is, from our perspective, that simple. The tariffs go away, and it's easier for us to move things between Canadian ports to make it easier for Canadian products to reach foreign markets and even for imports to reach where they want to be consumed in Canada. And I will let you get to lunch even faster, but we'll also, I guess, have some time for some questions or even comments if you would like.
Are there any questions from the audience for either myself or Jack? See, Peter is waving the mic around. We'll have a question over there. Yeah.
He wants to know when is lunch.
This one's for Niels. Niels, you had mentioned in your presentation there about first registry and second registry.
Yes.
Can you just give a brief description of what the differences between those two registries are, please?
Yes. So I actually have the regulations here in front of me, so I knew that a question was going to come about that. So Canada adopted a regulation that describes what an EU member state is and what an EU territory is. And the territories are explicitly excluded from the EU, okay? So what that means technically, I have a list of territories here. Like, for instance, Aruba. Aruba is not an EU member state. So if you are registered in Aruba, you do not fall under the exemptions. If you are registered in French Polynesia, same thing. Solomon Islands, same thing. It's only those 28 core member states that have their national register recognized under these new rules. Now, the second part is the international registers. And I'll just give you what they are. There's only 8 of them. And so if you register your vessel under one of these particular registries, then you fall under that exemption from, that has been installed by CETA. So we're talking about the Canary Islands, the International Danish Registry, the International French Registry, the German International Registry, Gibraltar, the Italian International Registry, and the Madeira International Registry. And so those are your only options. So if you have a vessel that is registered under one of these 8 registers, then you fall under the exemption for a coasting trade license, and you can enter into the coasting trade of Canada. Yeah.
And in the experience of Maersk Line, then the ships that we're using to trade between Montreal, Halifax, and North Europe, they're a combination of Dutch and English flag ships. Right. British, I should say.
Yeah.
I've got one question for Jack. I think we've been reading a lot about how this is going to spur trade between Canada and Europe, which, of course, with increased trade, you're getting increased activity at the Canadian ports. More containers moving in and out of those ports, which is great. Do you also foresee an increase, excuse me, in activity at the ports, not necessarily because of an increase in trade, but because cargo is being pulled from other ports, let's say, for example, U.S. ports, and the shipment and the containers are actually moving out of Montreal as a result of the fact that there may be more empty containers in Montreal for repositioning of containers have allowed for more containers to be, more cargo to be moved out of Montreal, which would otherwise have moved through U.S. ports?
The short answer is yes. The longer answer, I'm sorry, is that I don't think it would necessarily be because of CETA, but because Montreal is well positioned to serve the U.S. Midwest, for example. It makes logistical sense if you ignored the border, which is sometimes hard to do, to see how well Montreal connects to Detroit, Chicago, and so on. But there are a lot of companies that immediately assume that that must move through a U.S. port. But it's part of our group's responsibilities to introduce the upsides of moving cargo to and from the U.S. that way, and then that would increase the activity in ports like Montreal. It already happens to a great degree on the west coast of Canada today, not of course related at all to CETA, because that's Asia and Middle East, India, Pakistan trade, but at least depends on the month and the number, but 2/3 to 3/4 of what moves through Prince Rupert is really going to the U.S. Midwest.
Any further questions? Yes, Gabriel?
It's for Niels.
Hang on, wait. Yeah.
Niels, you mentioned the facilitation of trade of empty containers between Halifax and Montreal. Is that going to be expanded to other Canadian ports in the future?
No. This is a specific, the feeder services are specifically inscribed in CETA and the Canadian legislation to be only between Montreal and Halifax. Canada is willing to open up its markets, but just enough, not too much. So the short answer is no. No. Any other questions? Yes?
It's Saeed Nassif.
Peter is bringing you a mic. Yeah.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, Saeed Nassif from CIBS. Neil, you mentioned about those international registries. Are they open registry or closed registry, like Panama, Marshall Island, or whatever?
That's a good question. Most of these are open registries. Yes, they are open registries.